Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. On the wings of love, up and above the clouds, the only way to fly is on the wings of love. Hello, everyone. This is Rob. How are you guys doing? You guys doing good? You guys doing okay? I'm glad. In this video, we are covering Franklin Richards becoming the Phoenix. Yes, we are. Franklin Richards gets the Phoenix Force. Now, this takes place in the Ultimate Universe. For those of you guys who don't know about the Ultimate Universe in Marvel Comics, the Ultimate Universe is basically what the Marvel Cinematic Universe is based off of, right? We talked about that multiple times. That the MCU is based off a combination of the Ultimate Universe, the main Marvel Universe, and Earth 98, where heroes aged in real time. And so with that in mind, the Ultimate Universe imprint was launched in 2000 with the idea of basically answering the question, what would the Marvel Universe look like if it was essentially the world outside your window, if it was more real and more tangible? Now, the Phoenix Force as it exists in the Ultimate Universe is a little bit different from the Phoenix in the Marvel Universe, but also still the same. And the reason why is because as we know with the Phoenix, it's this omniversal force. The Phoenix itself is a singular entity, like the living tribunal, but there exists one facsimile of the Phoenix Force or one piece of itself in every single universe that exists out there, right? It's just how that person uses that power, right? So technically speaking, if a person in one universe became the White Phoenix of the Crown, the way that Jean Grey did in the main Marvel Universe, they would tap into the full totality of its power. But the indication that Marvel's given us over the years is you can only ever have one White Phoenix of the Crown at a time, because that's a person that basically possesses the full totality of the Phoenix Force's power, right? And so you can't really possess the full totality of its power if everybody has that power. And it's kind of crazy the way this unfolds, because like as this pops off, you immediately have Wolverine, who's just like, this is a hijacking. Anybody here who don't want to take a dirt nap, get off this train, right? Like everybody relax, nobody move. And then in turn, we find out that he's with what looks like Captain America, right? And it's kind of nuts because it's like, okay, so like, why is Captain America hijacking a train? It's really kind of a crazy scenario. And so what we end up getting here is also Kitty Pryde, who has the web shooters of Spider-Man. Now, for those of you guys asking how it is that this happens, in the Ultimate Universe, like Kitty Pryde was the one-time girlfriend of Spider-Man, right? And so the indication here is that she, of course, ended up getting Spider-Man's web shooters. And so from there, we end up having Franklin basically imbuing the powers or seemingly emanating the powers of the Phoenix. Now, he doesn't use them right off the bat. He's simply just kind of glowing orange. And that's when people basically start asking, like, are you sure this is going to work? And the response of Wolverine is, yes, definitely. The fact that like Rogue and Wolverine are together is a little weird, a little strange. Something I'm definitely not used to seeing. Rogue and Magneto were a thing back in the 1990s during Age of Apocalypse, which is really a story I wish they'd continued. But what this does is this train basically kind of goes crashing into a building. And when that happens, we basically end up switching over to the Baxter building in the modern day with regards to the Fantastic Four. Now, the Fantastic Four during the Ultimate Universe, and it was actually one of the most interesting iterations of their character, are starkly different in a lot of ways from the Fantastic Four in the main Marvel Universe, right? The Fantastic Four in the main Marvel Universe, that's the Fantastic Four right? Like nerdy Reed Richards, and like he's the guy who could just never really get the girl, but somehow managed to land Susan Storm, and then Doctor Doom is the villain, all that kind of stuff. In the Ultimate Universe, Reed Richards was a dick. Like it was crazy. He ended up becoming like a villain. He became the Maker. He literally created this entire citadel where he just started creating human beings and then aging them over the course of like 1,000 generations or something along those lines. But things were always on the fence between Reed and Susan, right? In the main Marvel Universe, they do have like their squabbles in the sense that like they bicker with each other, and including the events of Civil War, it looked like they were going to get a divorce, right? But it never really got that close. Instead, there was always them just basically reconciling and then things getting back to normal. And really one of the big issues that came between the two of them was Reed focusing on his work, right? During Jonathan Hickman's legendary run of the Fantastic Four, the idea of Reed trying to solve the problem of everything. What you ended up having here was Reed, who was just really, really cocky and arrogant. He was just a total jerk and ended up becoming a villain. The problem with this is that in the middle of this whole thing where he's talking to Susan, this train comes crashing in, right? Like this train from the future comes crashing into this building. And it's kind of nuts because these X-Men, of course, you have like Johnny, you have Ben Grimm who show up, the Thing who show up, and you've got like the X-Men who show up here seemingly alongside Captain America. And it's kind of like, okay, what in the world's going on? And they greet Reed Richards, and it's kind of like, okay, like we're essentially from the future, right? And we're looking for the Fantastic Four. We're trying to get a hold of Reed. And it's like, well, what can I help you with? And the response is like, you can die. And they immediately attack him, right? Like Wolverine and basically stabs him with his claws, and things kind of pop off. Now, one of the cool things about Wolverine that I want to talk about here while we're looking at this battle, one of the things that goes on with Wolverine is that in the Ultimate Universe, he's not the same as the main Marvel Universe, right? We've seen that like Wolverine's adamantium is basically indestructible in the main Marvel Universe. In the Ultimate Universe, it's just a really, really, really strong strong metal, but it can still be broken. The other half of this is that Reed's body cannot be easily destroyed, and there's argument to make there that he is in a lot of ways essentially immortal, right? The ways to kill him, you can count on one hand. It's exceedingly difficult to do. More so than that, we also end up finding out that with these X-Men being from the future, the experiences they've had, the training they've experienced is pretty significant insofar that Kitty Pryde simply had the ability to alter the molecular structure of her body so she could phase through solid matter. This future counterpart to her has essentially learned she can make her body super light so she can even go so far as to fly, but has also made it exceedingly dense to make herself super strong, which is not an ability that we've really seen her demonstrate before, and it's a cool adjustment to her character. The other part of this is that you have Susan Storm, who uses her ability to encase Franklin Richards. Now, there's precedent for this, and a lot of people would look at this and say Franklin using the power of the Phoenix should be able to overcome this, but we saw during Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run that Susan Storm's force field can actually hold off the power of Celestials. So there's precedence here for the power of Susan Storm's shield. The other half of this is, again, we can kind of go with this idea that Franklin hasn't quite learned how to use the full totality of the Phoenix powers, right? Either that or he's simply not the White Phoenix of the Crown. Now, in this universe, the Phoenix is the origin point of all life in this universe, right? The creation of sentient life came from the Phoenix. So we know it's at least universally powerful. Now we know the Phoenix as a whole is a multiversal force. So as a greater entity, it's nigh unstoppable, right? It represents the sum total of all life that has ever, currently does, and will ever exist. But again, within this universe, it looks like Franklin hasn't learned to use the full totality of its abilities, at least not in this regard. And so what it does is it basically leads to what looks like the power of the Phoenix, or the power of Franklin, basically grabbing Reed and then leaving. And so of course, Susan Storm and everybody else, as this group is flying away, Susan Storm and everybody else end up jumping in and saying, okay, we have to go get the X-Men from the modern day. And this is a cool thing because when they show up here, of course, you essentially got Jean, who's more or less leading the show, or leading the charge, but you've also got things like Susan Storm using her psychic abilities, for lack of a better word, the ability to create force fields, things like that, as being far more nuanced than it used to be, right? Like being able to create what equates to Wolverine's claws. It's a cool display of power here. That's kind of what's going on. Wolverine is wholeheartedly against this, right? The present day Wolverine is wholly against like invading the Baxter building, different things like that, and it's kind of like Reed probably had it coming, right? Especially because Reed had turned on the X-Men somewhere along the line. At least that seems to be the indication here. And so the response is, okay, then like let's basically kind of start working together, right? It's Jean Grey entering the mind of Wolverine and saying, you need to calm down, like we need your help on this, right? Wolverine is still a pretty formidable enemy, right? His healing factor is not as efficient as it is in the main Marvel universe. There's big differences here, but in a lot of ways, he's still kind of the ace in the hole of the X-Men team. And so with that being the case, Jean in the modern day, as the Phoenix, basically says, I can use this power to essentially locate, wherever these X-Men are. And when she starts picking up and starts homing in, what she realizes is that, the X-Men, when it was believed they left the Baxter building, that never actually happened. That instead, it was Franklin Richards using his power to trick the Fantastic Four, what was left of the Fantastic Four, into believing that they left. The other part of this, and this is one of the cool revelations that comes out of this, is that Reed, as you basically have the X-Men that start to leave, the future X-Men who kind of go seemingly to a different location, Franklin Richards starts to follow them, and then Reed stops him and he says, have you told anybody, right? Like, do they know? And the question is like, what are we talking about here? And the reality is no one knows that Franklin Richards is the son of Reed, right? None of them know that. And it's kind of a crazy thing because while Reed can't truly be killed, this really introduces the idea that he can basically cause an immense amount of pain and just kind of continues to torture him, right? And it's one of these interesting things because the truth is that Franklin doesn't really even seem to know that he's the son of Reed, right? Like Franklin doesn't really seem to know who his parents are at all. And before he really gets a chance to read the mind of Reed to find out if there's any truth to this, he's impaled from behind. And when the rest of the X-Men, these future X-Men come running in, it's like, who in the heck was it that attacked Franklin Richards? We end up having these Sentinels that have somehow made their way from the future to the present day, only for us to find out that these Sentinels are Wolverine. And this is amazing, right? This is a really, really cool idea. And again, this hits at the concept that Wolverine is really kind of one of these unstoppable forces. And we've seen this take place in a myriad of different comics over the years. We've seen it take place in What If comics, where Wolverine lived over 1,000 years and became this kind of messiah that led mutants into like a greater future, that was based on the Greg Rucka story, Enemy of the State, where Wolverine was essentially brainwashed by the Hand and Hydra into going on kind of a crusade. The What If story focused on that, but Wolverine was never stopped. stopped, right? Like nobody ever reversed it, and Wolverine ended up essentially killing the Marvel Universe, right? Like almost all the superheroes on Earth through a combination of his training, his bloodlust, his berserker rage if he goes into it, and his healing factor, as well as his adamantium, that Wolverine is a one-man army, and that if he sets out to take out a target, there's almost nothing that can stop him, right? The best display of that was during Daniel Way's Wolverine Origins, where he literally broke into the White House, right? So like it was cool to see these kinds of things go on, right? Like it was cool to see these scenarios take place. But all these various, guys start, these Wolverines start coming after these characters, right? They go after Kitty Pryde. Of course, she phases, and that takes care of things pretty quickly, at least in terms of her not really having to worry about the various Wolverines killing her. But with the modern day X-Men team showing up on the site, they basically come across this corpse and they're like, what in the world is going on here, right? Like what's taking place? And that's what we end up basically having, like all these forces, all these people have been chased after, and the Wolverines from the future have showed up. And then you end up learning that this Captain America is not actually Captain America, right? Like that's not the case. This Captain America is actually Cyclops, right? Like that's what's going on. And what we end up finding out here is that somewhere along the line that the Fantastic Four essentially turned on the mutant population. And when they did, Captain America was one of the people to essentially fall, right? Like, his essentially like a kind of a concept was introduced that basically saw his serum in his body being removed or being reduced, but whatever it is, he aged 100 years like that. And so Captain America ended up dying. And in response to that, basically Cyclops ended up taking up the mantle in his stead. And that's really what's been going on here, right? Like the other cool thing about this is we end up learning these Wolverines aren't really doing it intentionally. The truth is that they were basically they were co-opted. Wolverine himself was used to become the template for all these Sentinels when either the Fantastic Four or whoever they're working with ended up figuring out how capable he was and discovering that he's like the perfect killing machine, right? He's the perfect person to become a Sentinel, right? To modify and turn into a bad guy. And so from there, we end up jumping into the future, right? Like 20 years into the future, which is where all this really seemed to pop off. And you've got Bobby Drake, who's being chased after by these Wolverine Sentinels. And this is kind of a cool thing here, right? Because this is very reminiscent and is really in a lot of ways designed to mirror Days of Future Past, right? The worst case scenario for the X-Men. But for those of you guys who aren't really familiar with that, if you enjoy future dystopian stories, Days of Future Past was really kind of the first big one, right? Like that was really the first big scenario that we got in the X-Men mythos, where it was like, this is the future that awaits the X-Men if humanity ever decides to turn on them, activate the Sentinel program, and then we see what happens when the Sentinels become self-aware and enslave both humans and mutants, right? But then we started getting other futures like that. The Age of Apocalypse is a really good example, right? That timeline was caused by the son of Professor Xavier, a guy by the name of Legion. You might also know him as David Haller, right? But we've also seen that take place in the story Bishop, where we ended up learning that Hope Summers, who was the first mutant that was born after the events of what was called M Day, or the House of M, where the Scarlet Witch took away 98% of the mutant population's powers, she basically ended up initiating this 6-second war, right? Where she wiped out 1 million humans in 6 seconds. And that basically led to the same timeline as Bishop, right? We've seen this play out in different iterations. But what we end up having here is, or we end up finding out, that Reed has actually been taken by the Sentinels, right? And that Reed has been taken to the future and has kind of been locked away. Now, of course, Reed ends up using his intelligence to effectively break out, because this prison wasn't really designed to house somebody as smart as Reed. It was designed to house people that were less intelligent than Reed, right? So what better person to be able to break out of his own prison than Reed himself? Not only that, he's actually housed within the Baxter building, right? So it's kind of wild, because we end up having these interesting introductions here. The idea that like Namor the Submariner has joined the Fantastic Four, that Ben Grimm seems to have what's essentially an Iron Man suit. We've got Liz Allen, and I'm not going to go into who she is. We'll talk more about her at a future point, but nonetheless, like we basically have these characters here, right? And so being in this future is kind of wild, because everything has popped off for the mutant population. Like they've been subjugated, they're being taken prisoner, and the Fantastic Four are the ones who led this crusade against the entirety of the mutant population. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and we will wrap up the conclusion in the next video. Peace.